Baby author Kim Yoo-jung. A baby, upon entering this world, inherently holds the privilege of receiving unconditional adoration. Moreover, they are born with the ability to throw tantrums. Sometimes they issue commands. Wanga! Wah! They cry with tears streaming down their face. We don't find this noise unpleasant. Instead, we simply obey their orders, and we find joy in fulfilling our duty, embracing and kissing them while gently patting their cheeks, saying, "Oh, don't cry, my baby," because we also enjoy our responsibilities. However, for this baby born 2 months after his mother's marriage, he is an unwanted child. No one looks at him with kindness. He is stubborn and insists on his rights by constantly making noise. Adults scowl at him and turn away. Even crying has its limits. After some time, his strength weakens and he falls into a deep sleep. He curls his fists under his chin and weakly kicks his feet. Then, there's a sound like a mouse squeaking. Whenever his grandmother passes by, she makes a sound like this. Tsk, tsk, tsk. If his mother doesn't see him, tears come easily to his eyes. His grandfather is a bit hypocritical. "Oh, give him some milk, won't you? Do you think he cries for no reason?" He grumbles with a very good face on the outside, but when alone with his wife, they grumble under the blanket. "I can't stand this anymore because of his crying." "Well, I feel like my ears are falling off. My ears feel stuffed. What can I do about it? Should I just abandon him? What am I supposed to do with someone else's child?" Such quarrels occasionally arise. The mother is completely unaware of this. If she were to find out, she would certainly step in. Is this child not human? People's hearts can be truly frightening. She would confront the mother-in-law about it. Not knowing, she sits quietly beside the baby, doing nothing but sewing. Isn't the baby still cute? No, not at all. When you eagerly plead for the unborn baby to come out, that's when the baby appears cute. However, when you plead with the baby, "Don't come out, please do not come out," there's no way the baby appears cute. Instead, he seems like an unwanted adversary. Whenever the baby cries, the mother's face contorts. At times, she becomes incredibly cruel. "Hurry up and die. What good will come of you making a fuss?" She harshly scolds the baby. Whether this is directed at the baby or is a venting of frustration towards the meddling mother-in-law, she herself doesn't even know. The only one who truly loves the baby is his grandfather, the mother's father. Occasionally, when he visits, he happily takes the baby's dirty diaper, covered in green feces, and cleans it, enjoying the task. Then the baby laughs heartily, only at those moments. The maternal grandfather. He's a peculiar person. Despite having a grown daughter, he refuses to marry her off. Even if her breasts got bigger and pimples cover her face, he still won't agree. His reasoning is like this: "Why should I just give away my daughter? After raising her, I should reap some benefits. Only a rich man is worthy of her. Once caught, I'll cling on and never let go." But where can he find a rich man willing to marry her off like that? Rich men are always seeking wealthier matches. It was a principle, so he couldn't just give her away. In vain, her age keeps increasing. Then one day, the father's eyes widened. He hadn't noticed before, but upon closer inspection, his daughter's belly was swelling noticeably. Being pregnant at her age is just an ordinary occurrence, but it's not for her father. There's no such disgrace in the world when an unmarried girl bears a child. Oh, what a disaster! As night fell, he called his daughter out. "Are you pregnant?" Though the daughter responds with silence, bowing her head deeply. It's somewhat awkward for her father's dignity, leaving the situation as it is. He lets her be, wondering what will become of her. As the days go by, her stomach continues to swell. It has become as round as a pot. There's no room for doubt anymore. He suddenly raised his cane and scolded his daughter. Only then did she manage to confess that she had been involved with someone from an electric company. One lucky marriage would have made him a fortune. She could have done much better, but she settled for that guy from the electric company. Tears of blood well up in his eyes. Immediately, he sends his son to fetch him. He grabs the electric guy's hair and beats his buttocks with a club. Then he grabs a kitchen knife and threatens to kill both himself and her. Cutting off someone else's lifeline, that's what he did. Even if he kills him, it won't bring satisfaction. Somehow, that guy managed to escape, and there's no trace of where he went. Only his mother comes around, making a fuss, begging to find her son, and causing a commotion. So it's getting more and more difficult. If only I had let her marry the electric company guy. What should I do with this child now? She won't listen no matter how much I try to persuade her to take abortion pills. There's no other choice now. I'll have to entrust her to just anyone. He spread rumors that he is old and feeble, barely able to move his hands. Then he is going to pick a son-in-law, saying as long as the guy is sturdy, it doesn't matter who he is. Listening to this, the guy must have been greatly astonished. He sat there dumbfounded, with his chopsticks in hand as if he had stopped eating dinner. It's too good to be true. He had been married before, but after 4 years, his wife ran away. Perhaps she couldn't stand living in such a poor house. Since then, he spent a full 5 years without a wife. Being over 30 and without money, finding a wife is like finding a needle in a haystack. The bride is a virgin, and on top of that, she even owns land capable of producing 50 sacks of rice. This is truly... Father, is it really true? Of course it is. Why would I joke about this? The old father replied firmly while puffing on his pipe, lost in his own thoughts. Stop making a fuss and just do as you're told. This is inevitable for our family's future, the mother murmured beside him. But they insist on seeing you once, without even looking at the household or considering status, just to see the groom alone, the father said, closing his eyes firmly. The issue lies with the son's age. After all the effort spent on this arrangement, facing rejection due to old age would be a bitter experience. Go and try to make yourself look younger tomorrow. That girl graduated from a vocational school, so she still has some standards for potential husbands. A vocational school? This is even more surprising. It's like a stroke of luck. Pilsu used to work as a typesetter at a printing house. He had accumulated over 10 years of experience and was earning a good monthly salary of 61. However, due to the economic downturn, he was laid off. The reason for his dismissal was his lack of proficiency in Japanese, his nemesis. If he had a wife who was fluent in Japanese and could teach him every day, he would grasp it within a few months. It's quite delightful. But nowadays, girls attending school aspire to marry college students. Surely, no one would want to marry an ignorant, unemployed person like him. Father, if she went to a vocational school, do I really have a chance? The son asks the same question, like feeling nervous and anxious. It's late at night, but sleep eludes him. The resentment of being unable to study due to lack of money, the anguish of losing a job, it's truly cruel. Is he destined to grow old like this, working as his father's assistant, a junkyard broker for the rest of his life? His father can't escape feeling guilty either. Eventually, he strokes his graying beard and answers cheerfully, "It could be." This thought crosses his mind, his cousin who works as a doctor. Among relatives, there's no one as respected or prosperous as him. Indeed, when it comes to seeking a prestigious profession in the world, there's hardly anything as good as being a doctor. Tomorrow, go and pretend to be a doctor, his father said. In marriage, boasting often accompanies the process. If it works out, that would be great, but if it doesn't, that's all there is to it, isn't it? The next day before noon, the father confided in their doctor relative and pleaded for help to borrow 3 items: an old cloth coat, a leather bag, and a doctor's robe commonly worn by a doctor. He arranged to borrow these 3 items for just 1 day. When he returned home, his son was already dressing up. He had oiled his hair and powdered his face. He looked a bit younger. "Let's go, son. Put it on." As his mother helped him put on the robe, the son couldn't contain his excitement. He looked quite different with the robe and the leather bag. "What's this? Even putting on makeup and wearing all these," the son exclaimed, gesturing and posing dramatically. He seemed pleased, but also had a hint of embarrassment. "Son, it's time to behave like an adult," his father said, seeing his son mature in age but still so naive. He worried if he would just chatter away without any purpose. "It's okay, decent people usually dress in various clothes." Then, they both went to the main gate where his father personally hailed a rickshaw for him. He handed the rickshaw puller 40 jians in advance, feeling a bit reluctant. He barely earns 40 jians a day as a junkyard broker. Worried that this money might go to waste, he said, "Say that you stopped there on your way to the hospital," and then added, "Say you came because your father asked you to. Don't blabber about unnecessary things." The son sat arrogantly with an empty bag by his side. Anyway, the father's words were quite fitting. That evening, a messenger came from the bride's house, intentionally indicating that he was the finest groom they had yet encountered. Since it's customary for weddings to be promptly arranged, we suggested settling the matter as soon as possible. How about tomorrow? They didn't bother discerning between favorable and unfavorable outcomes. They simply bowed their heads and hoped for a swift resolution, even to the messenger. However, there was also a concern. What was initially intended as a mere glimpse of the groom has now unveiled the unfavorable household circumstances. If we don't resolve this quickly, before the marriage becomes void, there's no other choice. 4 days later, the wedding will take place hastily. Where does the money for the wedding expenses come from if the food situation is dire? Without much thought, he went around borrowing from relatives' homes or his close friend's house until his throat was dry. He managed to gather around 41 to repay it in a month, but even that wasn't enough. If we're going to do it, we might as well spend enough so that it doesn't look shabby. Even on the day of the wedding, the elderly parents went out to borrow money from the crack of dawn. As the late autumn wind whispered through the sleeves, his wife trembled, looking at him anxiously. What if we can't repay these loans we're taking? She worried incessantly. But the husband remained undeterred, walking calmly without turning his head. We're borrowing for now, but we'll pay it back little by little in due time, he reassured, his demeanor calm and composed. When Pilsu's wedding was taking place, the household was bustling with excitement. With preparations for the feast underway, everyone was eagerly anticipating the delicious food. It seemed like even the neighboring families and village girls had gathered, hoping for a share of the festivities. Despite his overall happiness, Pilsu had some lingering concerns. This time, Pilsu's first significant motivation was land. However, upon examining the impression of his future father-in-law, he seemed rather stern. As Pilsu entered the room and bowed respectfully before him, he introduced himself, saying, "I am Pilsu Kim, sir, here on behalf of my elders." In response, the father-in-law, with a dignified air, simply gestured, "Yes, please have a seat." He responded firmly but courteously. Even though his hair was white, his demeanor seemed impeccably composed. Amidst various conversations, he suddenly asked, "So, you've been practicing medicine a lot. Have you managed to save up some money?" "Well, I wouldn't say a lot, but I've saved up around 10,000 won." That's quite a sum." The daughter-in-law hesitated as she looked at the table. However, she asked, "Are we having fish soup again today?" Her expression clouded with dissatisfaction. Hadn't they just had it yesterday? Her appetite seemed unpredictable. She had asked for fish soup yesterday, so why was she being so fickle now? Her whims were truly beyond comprehension. "Please take this away and bring me some rice punch," she said. Just as ordered, the mother-in-law silently complied. It would be disastrous if she returned to her parents' home because of her temper. The daughter-in-law had a talent for showing off clothes. Occasionally, she rummaged through clothes brought from her parents' house and proudly declared, "We only wear fine clothes here, none of those coarse ones." It was unbearable to see her like this. One might think she had grown up in luxury and acted accordingly, suppressing her discomfort and saying, "Yes, you're right. It must be that way in your family. How couldn't it be so?" Then the daughter who had left for marriage returned. She looked frail, with no color in her cheeks, as if she could collapse any moment. She wasn't even 30 yet, but her youthful vigor had faded, and she had become a shadow of her former self. "Mother, I can't bear it anymore," she said, clutching her hands and shedding tears. Her hunched figure and tear-stained face showed deep resentment towards her parents. "Did he hurt you again? I can't take it anymore." And she buried her head in her mother's embrace, sobbing silently. Her mother's thoughts were evident without further inquiry. There was palpable resentment, as if she wanted immediate revenge, sending their daughter as a fifth concubine to a much older man just because he owned vast lands. Was that acceptable? Her parents had hoped he might offer them some land as part of the dowry, but all that resulted was their daughter's face turning pale from the ordeal. And when that man drank, he became uncontrollable, causing havoc. What a disgraceful situation. But it was all in their destiny. "Don't cry," Pilsu's wife might hear. "It's embarrassing if others see you. Stop crying. she said, firmly leading her daughter by the wrist to the neighboring room. As a mother who had witnessed her daughter's inability to live in her marital home and her subsequent expulsion, her grief was undoubtedly profound. She sat her daughter down and comforted her incessantly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My child, there's no other way. Married life is like this," she said, wiping away her tears. "Being born as a woman is a sin. Who can you blame?" She wiped her own tears and sometimes even tried to offer her a cigarette. "Smoke a cigarette. It might ease your frustration." She tried to console her like this. However, when she met her husband at night in bed, she muttered, "You said that marriage was supposed to bring prosperity, but it brought us suffering instead." As her elderly wife nagged, the old husband listened without offering any excuse. Still, who would pray for their daughter to suffer to the extent that her face turned yellow? Well, it's not like that. Who pulls their husband's beard like that? He retorted, trying to maintain composure. It was a struggle to soothe his angry wife. However, his wife, too, had a worn-out body from caring for her daughter-in-law. Since their daughter was coming home anyway, they delegated cooking and setting the table to her, hoping she could adjust her tastes a bit. Their daughter had always been that way since childhood. Moreover, meeting a cruel husband had left her as nothing but a hollow shell. She now complied obediently with whatever she was instructed to do. However, from her perspective, it felt awkward to rely on her parents' hospitality for food, and she was undoubtedly acutely aware of the situation. It was a bitterly cold winter day, with the biting wind howling from the eaves. Frost formed on the windows, and even though it was just a modest thatched roof house, it must have felt exceptionally chilly. When the daughter got up early in the morning, her insides trembled noticeably. Seeing her washing rice with trembling hands in cold water was heart-wrenching. "Hey, could you please throw away this chamber pot?" a voice from the neighboring room shouted. The weather was so severe today that she didn't even bother with the chamber pot. Usually she just did as she was told, but today was different. She didn't lift a finger. Being treated like this while shivering outside, she didn't respond, just ignored it. But murmurs could still be heard faintly. Although not clearly, it was likely gossip or even curses. After barely cooking the rice and bringing it to the table, the sister-in-law didn't even bother to look up. And before she could leave the room, the sister-in-law quickly scooped a spoonful of rice, chewed it, and said, "Is this even food? It's like chewing on rocks." Then she sharply tapped the spoon on the table. That scene was so unpleasant that her eyes stung with irritation. After staring down at her for a while, unable to comprehend, she finally said, "Enough, for heaven's sake. Go and do it yourself." "If it's too cold, will you skip your meal?" "I'm pregnant. At least consider the circumstances. You should bear a child, then you can understand me." This was quite astonishing. Whose child was she pregnant with that she was acting so arrogantly? Nowadays, even toward her mother-in-law, her reckless behavior was outrageous. "Nobody asked you to bear that baby in your belly. Why are you so conceited?" she said, unable to hold back. But suddenly, "What?" she yelled back, grabbing her by the hair and pulling her toward her, then slapped her face several times. Her wide face was covered in a thick layer of cunningness, showing she was in the mood for a quarrel. "I've never witnessed such a disgraceful scene in our house before." The sister-in-law, naturally fragile and lacking authority to intervene, could only endure the blows. Later, she cried loudly, not just from the pain, but also from the bitterness of her situation. Enraged, the father, who had been resting in the bedroom, burst out and opened the door. "Why are you causing trouble again, woman?" he scolded his daughter instead of consoling her. It would have been better if she had left things alone. Why pick a fight for no reason? Especially considering the complaints from the daughter-in-law lately, saying she'll go back to her parents' home. He was so angry that he blamed his daughter for causing trouble and vented his own frustrations about his daughter-in-law. The air was thick with anger as the daughter decided to leave her parental home, crying and blaming her father for ruining her life. Witnessing all this, the mother-in-law couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. She had initially supported her daughter-in-law wholeheartedly, but now she was fed up. What was meant to be a goodwill gesture toward her father, who had promised them land, was now being taken advantage of while caring for her daughter-in-law. It wasn't funny at all. At one point, she had even convinced her son to investigate the matter himself. Surely they would eventually receive the land, she thought, but waiting indefinitely for it was uncertain. If we were well off, it wouldn't matter, but we're not. Besides, your father said he'd give us the land anyway, so why not go and talk to him? Her husband suggested, trying to make a point. His wife, seeming to agree, replied, I've been thinking the same thing, but with empty hands, I don't. Her voice trailed off, clouded with uncertainty. She had a valid point. After all, to catch a good fish, you needed good bait first. Then what should we do? His wife closed her eyes as if contemplating, then suggested, how about fetching that phonograph? Father seems to appreciate such items. Having received a request to sell the phonograph to the shop, her father had gone to retrieve the item from someone else's house that afternoon. It was an old item that might fetch around 15 if sold well. She insisted she would bring it back the next morning. So when she went to her parents' home with the phonograph that evening and returned empty-handed the next afternoon, her husband asked, how did it go? It's not supposed to be done quickly. He said he'll return it slowly. That's all there is to it. The phonograph disappeared as if it had been secretly eaten. Because of that, the entire household suffered trying to compensate for the lost item. It seems that rather than receiving kindness from the father-in-law, they were actually being taken advantage of. Although the mother-in-law deeply resented her daughter-in-law, confronting her directly was difficult, so she turned to her husband instead. Is this what you call taking advantage of a wealthy daughter-in-law? Are you planning to consume our daughter and even our son, you scoundrel? Ouch, don't do this. Who pinches her husband? Even though he doesn't voice it out loud, there's always a bitter taste in his mouth. As the days go by and the behavior of his daughter-in-law becomes increasingly insolent, he feels a sense of disgust. Of course, he knows it's partly his fault for allowing things to escalate this far. But now that the damage is done, he feels powerless to change anything. Sometimes he just turns away from his daughter-in-law, spits out his frustration, and massages his temples in exasperation. As time goes by, the son begins to develop affection for his wife. However, on the other hand, her appearance is far from pleasing, and the land promised by her father is nowhere to be seen. However, it's not just about that. Now, in his 40s and being his father's son, just hearing the name wife brings him satisfaction. Moreover, after spending a couple of months together, it's an undeniable fact that the son's affection has grown significantly. When his mother subtly urges him in the kitchen, "When are you sending that away? Is it because there's no woman around that you live with such things?" she complains. Well, the son had indeed experienced some conflicts with his wife. It was about a month after they got married. Despite bringing his wife home, there was nothing to feed her. Burdened by accumulated debts, his stress had reached a breaking point. Sitting on the veranda under the sunlight, lost in his thoughts, a plump man suddenly appeared holding a book. Babbling incomprehensibly in Japanese, "Watatataruken Hadoken," it was unclear what he meant. Fortunately, his wife was indoors at the time, which he finds relieving. "Hey, what's all this about? Come here and answer him," he demands. "Stop being ridiculous. What kind of man makes his wife talk to other men like this?" she retorts angrily. "It's fine, you went to school." Still, she remains silent inside the room, unmoving. After standing awkwardly for a while, the Japanese man finally opens his eyes wide and utters loud gibberish before storming out. With no response to his words and just muttering to himself, he was probably angry. Maybe it was words of curse. "What did you say? Say that again!" he bellows, threatening to rip her legs apart as he raises one leg high. But before he can act, she effortlessly raises her other leg into the air. "Go ahead, tear them apart," she challenges, lifting both legs simultaneously. It's no small feat to lift even one heavy leg, let alone both at once. In moments like these, the lack of strength is truly another sorrowful aspect of the situation. "Ah, disgusting!" Throwing aside the leg he had grabbed, he storms off in anger. In such a chaotic environment, the baby arrives unexpectedly early in the first days of the month, on a particularly fierce day. Since morning, the mother had been experiencing stomach pains, and by evening, she suddenly gives birth. No one could have anticipated it. Goodness gracious! As the cry echoes through the house, everyone rushes to see what happened. The baby had become entangled in the footrest. Seeing this, the mother-in-law furrows her brow and makes a disapproving sound. Even the father, witnessing the scene, feels uneasy and can only click his tongue in disapproval. But with urgency at hand, the husband rushes to support his wife, while the mother-in-law grabs the baby with both hands, and they hurriedly attend to them in the room. The baby cries out, "Wah! Wah!" with her tiny mouth. No one was intentionally looking at the baby, but it's clear she's a daughter. Born into such confusion, the baby seems unlucky to be adored. The person who dislikes the baby the most is the grandmother. She scolds her husband, saying, "We don't need someone else's child. Either get rid of her or kill her." On reflection, the grandmother's words don't seem entirely unreasonable. Why should they raise someone else's child and endure hardship? What's the point? Maybe, if they raise her as a geisha, she'll repay their kindness someday. But when will the baby grow up and learn the skills of a geisha? By then, the two old folks will be lying in the ground, 6 feet under, bones turned to dust. And perhaps, one day, the baby will resemble her mother. But if her face and temperament resemble her mother's, and she turns out to be as unpleasant, what then? With these thoughts, the baby becomes increasingly disliked, and the wife's words sound convincing and sweet to the grandfather. Furthermore, the unlucky baby cries day and night. One day, in the afternoon, the baby's mother went alone to her parents' house, probably to ask for some money for cigarettes. Seizing the opportunity, the grandmother quietly opens the door to the adjacent room and enters. The baby lies silently in the empty room. As the wife suggested, the grandfather approaches to lift the baby. Surprisingly, the baby grabs onto his beard with excitement, clearly pleased. Now over 2 months old, the baby even begins to giggle. Upon observing this, the grandfather realizes how absurd it would be to harm the child. First, he lifts the baby's face and says, "That's right, this little one recognizes people. Huh?" Unable to resist, he plants kisses on the chubby cheeks, a sight too endearing to withstand. Thus, the plan he had in mind melts away in an instant. "We didn't come here to play with that damn baby, don't you understand? Why such nonsense?" Mutters the grandmother beside him, grumbling. "Heh! Unacceptable. How can someone behave like this as a human being?" grumbles the grandfather, momentarily forgetting his earlier thoughts and staring off into the distance. This has probably happened several times before. The son is oblivious to such sentiments. He doesn't have the luxury to contemplate whether his daughter is pretty or ugly. Every day, he goes out looking for work, only to return late at night when it's already dark. Exhausted, he collapses into bed and falls asleep without a care in the world. With his meager earnings, it's impossible to manage household expenses. It's a real struggle just to put food on the table every day. As the evening approaches, he returns home with weary eyes. Folding his arms, he shivers slightly and mutters, "Give me some food," before questioning, "Haven't you even lit a fire in this room?" Instead of answering, his wife just sighs heavily. Lighting a fire with just a few pieces of meager firewood, today there isn't even that much. Even the baby looks cold on the chilly floor of the room. Without even glancing, the husband spoon feeds the rice into his mouth. It's frustrating to see nothing come to fruition and to have only a growing appetite without any purpose. Even the same food seems to be more needed when one is poor and still hungry. This, too, is probably just another futile complaint. Setting down the chopsticks, he pushes his tongue against the roof of his mouth, trying to squeeze out every last bit of rice from between his teeth. And then, as he goes to drink water, "Darling, let's just get rid of our child," his wife says, blinking her eyes as she looks at him. "Why did you even bother giving birth if you're just going to abandon her?" "Well, His wife responds with an awkward expression. In reality, their daughter isn't particularly adorable. Because of this, she can't assert herself against her parents-in-laws. Even if she tries to assert herself a bit, as soon as the baby cries in the room, it's as if she's exposing her weaknesses and bringing shame upon herself. She feels utterly demoralized by her past mistakes. And now, everything about the baby that was once adorable seems not so adorable anymore. It's strange how everyone says something is ugly. Then it does look ugly. That's not what I mean. We don't have to endure together. If the baby goes to a wealthy family's home, that'd be good for her too. Her words sound convincing. Well, he ponders. Maybe it's better for her to go to a house where she can live comfortably rather than being constantly pressured here. And when the baby grows up a bit, she'll eat much more than now. Even a small mouth like hers can be intimidating in this impoverished environment. Plus, she cries a lot at night. Oh well, whatever suits you. Just find a better place to live. Sure. Stop worrying. Noticing that it's past midnight, the husband takes the baby bundled up in a wrap and quietly slips outside with the baby, worried that if the parents find out, there will be trouble. The streets are already deserted with only the sharp wind blowing. Everything is blanketed in layers of snow, glistening under the faint moonlight, and the snow continues to fall softly. Engaging in such behavior could lead to trouble if caught by the authorities. Without that concern, he could go wherever he pleased and do as he wished. He traverses the dark alleyways of Zhongro, constantly glancing over his shoulder at the slightest noise, fearing it might be someone following. Finally, entering the alley of Dabangal, he feels a sense of relief. Seeing no footprints on the freshly fallen snow reassures him that there's little risk of being discovered. Dabangal, known as the Red Light District, is where concubines secure lodging and live separately from their husbands' main households. It's not easy for such women to bear children. Therefore, finding a baby and raising it for the sake of fulfillment in life is a common practice for them. However, once inside, there will be no shortage of care and attention. Maybe she'll have a good meal and loosen her belt every day, and perhaps remember to repay the kindness later. He starts by looking for a suitable entrance. Entering a dead-end alley, he finds a grand door, freshly painted white and adorned with intricate designs. While he may not know for sure, such an impressive sight suggests wealth. Satisfied, he gently places the wrapped-up baby on the doorstep. The baby is fast asleep. If she gets cold and cries out, a maid will come out and pick her up, and the head of the household will see, and this is how it will happen. He briskly exits the alley without looking back. However, as he walks, his legs grow heavier, trembling under his arm. It would be fortunate if the baby cried out, but what if she froze to death before making a sound? Fixing the baby's life for the better is no excuse for leaving his daughter to freeze. That would be a heartless act. With a sudden sense of guilt, he turns back. The baby remains sound asleep, unaware of the danger. Fearful of being seen by others, he quickly picks her up and hurries away. This wouldn't do, maybe next spring. And now he wonders why he had even left home in the first place, feeling a sense of unease. On the way home, he walks confidently along the main road. The snow falls heavily, almost freezing in the cold wind. However, although one worry has been relieved, another concern arises. If he takes the baby home, he'll surely face criticism from his wife. These days, she's the kind of woman who would argue, if you're a doctor, then even dogs and cows are doctors at the slightest provocation. Why'd I even come out in the first place, going through all this trouble? He grumbles, clicking his tongue several times. Published in 1939.